Hello and welcome back to the Indie Skies YouTube channel, where today the forecast is looking pink. Pink is maybe the colour with the most loaded baggage in terms of its connotations and associations, especially within the realms of femininity and gender. Outdated notions of pink is for girls, blue is for boys are still commonplace. The colour pink is widely associated with feminine traits such as softness, innocence and romance, and we see this reinforced constantly in media and marketing. Pink is also associated with tranquility and calm, compassion, comfort and youth. A hotter, more intense pink can be more closely associated with excitement, playfulness and even hedonism. In terms of music, the colour pink is probably most closely tied to pop music, which makes sense. Popular culture, pop music in particular, has traditionally been one of the arenas in which gender roles and notions of femininity are perpetuated. Also, generally, pop artists and the labels involved in distributing their music are trying to capture the widest audience as possible, and pink can be seen as a pretty low-stakes, fun and welcoming colour, particularly for younger people who are a key target audience. And this is probably why we're seeing an increase of pink and hip-hop aesthetics too. The colour pink obviously has a long history within hip-hop, but it used to feel novel or even countercultural. And now that hip-hop has grown into the biggest genre in the world, you have rappers and labels hell-bent on expanding the pool of listeners beyond traditional hip-hop fans. Pink is approachable, pink is youthful, you know the deal. And that's why pink is everywhere in hip-hop, both in general aesthetics and in album covers. But what about outside the mainstream, with bands that have niche fan bases and who may not have such strict commercial imperatives? Well, pink album covers aren't particularly common, and perhaps because of this they seem especially memorable. If I asked you right now to think of albums with pink covers, I think the same few albums would come to mind for most people. Whereas if I asked about red covers, everybody probably has different ideas. Anyway, let's look at a few categories of pink album covers, delve deeper, and see if we can reach any loose conclusions about the nature of pink album covers. First we'll look at plain pink album covers, then we'll look at albums that use pink to set the vibe, and then we're going to talk about a secret third category, which I think is probably the most interesting, but we'll get to that later. We're just going to be talking about albums that are majority pink, so no albums that just have a little bit of pink on them. Also, if you do enjoy the video, please press the like button. This is a new channel, and that would really help me out. Subscribe, I've got a bunch of videos on the way, and get down in the comments, give me any feedback. Let's talk about our favourite pink albums or just music in general. Okay, that's it, let's get into it. Okay, plain or pretty much plain album covers are generally pretty common and can be iconic for their simplicity and what they exclude. If I show you these album covers, for example, without needing to read any of the text, you're probably able to identify them. Now, obviously each album is different, but I think plain covers can often function as a way to let the music stand alone, encouraging listeners to go into the experience without any preconceptions. They're often paired with unassuming titles such as The Beatles' self-titled, also known as the White Album, Metallica self-titled, which is the Black Album, and Untitled Unmastered by Kendrick Lamar. And this is the case with the first album we're going to talk about today, which is Sunny Day Real Estate by Sunny Day Real Estate. This album from Seattle emo rockers Sunny Day Real Estate came out in 1995. Colloquially, it's known as LP2, or you guessed it, the Pink Album. Now, following the release of their debut emo classic Diary in 1994, the band went through some serious internal conflict. And next year they would actually decide to split while they were still working on LP2. According to the band, at this point they just wanted to get the album out as quickly as possible. On a lot of the songs, they didn't even finish the lyrics, so lead vocalist Jeremy Enoch just improvised and sung gibberish. And as far as the cover, the story goes that when it came time to turn in the album to the label, the band didn't have any artwork, so spur of the moment, they decided on the pink cover. I think there was more to it though. The low-key pink cover feels like the band signalling to fans that this might not be the follow-up to Diary that they expected, because they do take risks on this album. There was a lot of post-hardcore heaviness on Diary, and while there are still heavy moments on this album, they're surrounded by more melody and atmosphere. The guitar is warmer and cleaner, and Enoch's vocals are generally more restrained and harmonic. The song structures shift abruptly, and the lyrics rely heavily on imagery as opposed to narrative or concept. This album still rips. It's actually a miracle that it sounds as good as it does, considering the circumstances in which it was made. But it was a big departure for a band who had made such a perfect distillation of a sound on their debut album. And that's where the old pink cover trick comes in. Okay, next we're going to talk about Solace by rapper Earl Sweatshirt. Now this is a bit of a grey area, because it could be considered just one 10-minute song, but I'm choosing to count it as an album/EP because I think it's incredible, and also because I think it adds something to the discussion of why artists might choose pink covers. Now this project is interesting because it's just flat out depressing. I've seen it said many times on the internet that it sounds like depression feels. It really is visceral. Earl himself calls it music from when I hit the bottom and found something. So why the pastel pink cover? Well, I think it was intentional. At this stage of his career, Earl was still very much adjusting to being in the public eye after his return from boarding school in Samoa. His first album back was Doris in 2013, which had a big rollout and a big label push. But then his next three projects were I Don't Like Shit I Don't Go Outside, with its understated black cover, Solace, which was a random YouTube drop and had the plain pink cover, and some rap songs, which had the blurry selfie as the cover. He also didn't have much of a social media presence at this time either. This clear rejection of any sort of developed or attention-grabbing aesthetic feels like an attempt by Earl to have the music judged purely on merit, to shrug off any sort of expectations placed upon him. And remember, at this time, the expectations were really high, and the fans were really demanding. Odd Future had blown up while Earl was in Samoa, there was a whole Free Earl campaign, and it feels a little bit like he played ball with Doris, and then since then, more and more, we've just seen him do his own thing. So the pink cover, the YouTube drop, the music from when I hit the bottom in the description, it's Earl making it clear that he's not dropping this to prove anything. This is for him. Also, you guys will have to let me know what you think about this in the comments, but the pink could kind of represent the hope you find when you're at your lowest. The last instrumental piece on the project is definitely the most hopeful sounding part of the whole thing. It is a hopeful way to end. Also, the pink does send a different message than a black cover, for instance, would have.
Late for everything, my face to the cement, that's how I always seen it. I spent days faded in anemia.
Okay, next we're going to talk about two albums whose plain pink covers, to keep it simple, suit the vibe of the music. First, let's talk about Snowball by the Field Mice. These guys were an English jangle pop band making music in the late 80s and early 90s. Snowball was their debut album and it came out in 1989. I spilled my mate, but I'm freaking locked in. No, I'll clean it. For me, this is actually a hallmark of twee music of that era, and actually it feels a bit reductive to even call it twee music because of the associations with the genre. This album still has the jangly guitar and the sweet, innocent lyrics that you'd expect, but in many ways it's quite unconventional. There's a bit of a mix of genres with some synthy dream pop elements and even some proto-shoegaze stuff. The songs are longer than a lot of similar stuff at the time, and there's stretches of instrumental sprinkled throughout the album too. The songwriting leans on repetition, and the lyrics and structures are geared more towards creating a vibe than developing a narrative, say. And the album does just have a really cozy, warm vibe. This is exemplified by the song Couldn't Feel Safer, which is a standout in my opinion, with lyrics like, "And I couldn't feel safer. I always feel this way, like no harm can come to me when I'm in your company." So these songs are full of melancholy, but it's a sweet melancholy. It's not bitter. And that sweetness and that cozy warmth is where the pink cover comes in. This album is definitely pastel, but it wouldn't suit an ice blue or a light green, for example. The vibe is just pink.
I always feel this way, but no harm can come to me when I'm in your company.
And the same can be said for our next album, Zero by Ichiko Aoba. Ichiko Aoba is a Japanese folk singer-songwriter, and interestingly enough, she actually has a number of plain album covers in her discography. She has a white cover, a pale brown cover, a pale green cover, a light blue cover, and this pink cover, which we're going to talk about today. I'm not familiar enough with her catalogue to know if there's a reason behind this, or whether these covers suit each album, but what I do know is that the pink cover definitely suits Zero. This album is just so beautiful. It's full of these sparse, meandering folk songs. They can be playful, they can be haunting, and kind of everything in between. There's no percussion or anything used. It's pretty much just some oftentimes ornate acoustic guitar and Ichiko's incredible clear vocals. And this can feel very intimate. You can pretty much hear every breath that she's taking. And this, combined with the field recordings that are used throughout of bird song or wind whistling through the grass, creates this really peaceful, cozy, and captivating atmosphere. The lyrics are all sung in Japanese. I don't speak Japanese, but in many ways that adds to the experience. I'm really just focusing on the rhythm and the emotion in her voice and the soundscape crafted by her guitar and the field recordings. The album isn't always gentle like the cover might suggest, but that isn't the point. It's an experience. It has the potential to immerse you and transport you into this dreamlike space, and it just kind of makes sense that that space would be Pink. Okay, moving on from plain Pink covers, but sticking with albums that use Pink to set a vibe, let's talk about possibly the most well-known example of this phenomenon. I am of course talking about Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. Loveless was released by Irish band My Bloody Valentine in 1991, and it's widely considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, shoegaze album of all time. And actually, just one of the greatest albums of all time, full stop. And I don't necessarily know what I could add to the discourse about this album, so let's just focus on the cover. The cover is fuzzy, it's abstract, it's distorted, and of course, the music is fuzzy, abstract, and distorted. There's these flashes of warm pinks and reds bleeding into each other, which mirrors the warm and colourful sounds in the album, bleeding into each other, playing off each other, creating these really dreamy soundscapes. I'm reminded of the visuals you get behind your eyelids when you close your eyes and look at the sun, and the music feels like an accompaniment to that experience. It's kaleidoscopic, it's encompassing. You can just about make out a guitar on the cover, buried amongst all the visual cacophony, and that feels pretty fitting too. There's not much to hold on to on this album beyond the riffs and the licks. The vocals are often baked into the mix, the lyrics are esoteric. And without wanting to sound reductive, this album is all about the sounds. And you know, maybe without quite being able to put my finger on why, they sound Pink, or at least they sound like this cover. And this is an essential, masterful album, and it's the highest compliment to say that I don't think you could ever improve on the cover. Next, I want to touch on another project where there's a clear correlation between the Pink cover and the vibe of the album. Let's talk about Shaking the Habitual by The Knife. The Knife are an electronic music sibling duo from Sweden, and this album came out in 2013. Unlike a lot of the covers we're talking about today, which lean towards using lighter, more comforting shades of pink, this album uses a confronting, hot pink, and contextually, it makes a lot of sense. This album is purposefully jarring, so much so that the duo considered releasing it under a pseudonym, given how much of a departure it was from their previous electro and synth pop experiments. They didn't make any concessions with this album to make it accessible. Quite the opposite, actually. This thing is 96 minutes long. Sonically, it's very polarizing. There's some great, catchy and experimental pop tunes on this thing. There's also some long stretches of ambient and drone, which may take some listeners out of the experience. The song Old Dreams Waiting to be Realized, for example, is 19 minutes of droning ambience. It's very understated, to put it kindly, and that's smack bang right in the middle of the album. Then there's the very overt political messaging, which is at the heart of this album. It's very anti-capitalism, critiquing the structures that keep people locked in cycles of inequality and exploitation. The vinyl cover calls for an end of extreme wealth. The album also explores gender and sexuality, feminism, activism, and environmentalism. The title of the album, Shaking the Habitual, is actually taken from a quote by French philosopher Michel Foucault, which I'll read out for you. And I'm paraphrasing slightly. The work of an intellectual is to shake up the habitual ways of working and thinking, to dissipate conventional familiarities, to reevaluate rules and institutions, and to participate in the formation of a political will. So you can really see how the concept and content is aligned with the music, and how the cover fits into the overall reading of the product. You know, it's hard to look at, with the loud hot pink clashing harshly with the turquoise green. A cover that's hard to look at for an album which in many ways is hard to listen to. Okay, we're going to look at one more album whose pink cover sets the vibe, and this will lead us into the discussion of our third and final category of pink album covers, You'll see what I mean. Let's talk about Glow On by Turnstile. Turnstile are a band from Baltimore and they make hardcore music, or at least that's what most people would say. There is a group of people who might call themselves purists that would argue that since the release of Glow On in 2021, Turnstile was no longer a hardcore band, and that's where the Pink cover comes in. Now, whether you're one of the people who think Turnstile sold out and became mallcore, or if you're one of the people who appreciated the crossover into a more accessible sound, you can't deny there was a shift from their previous work. Glow On is cleaner, it's glossier, it's warmer. It still has a hardcore bones. There's some killer riffs on this thing, but it is a crossover record. It's full of indie rock and dream pop elements. Now, we're going to end this video by discussing the trend of bands who make heavy music, releasing a more accessible album and slapping a pink cover on it. And that's the case here. Accessible album, fuzzy pink cover. And if it was a band's intention to increase their appeal, it worked. This album was critically acclaimed. It placed highly on many year-end lists and even topped a few. It was the band's first album to chart on the Billboard Top 200, debuting at number 30. They played on Jimmy Fallon, and they were nominated for 3 Grammys off the back of this album.
Let the spotlight shine on me again.
So let's talk about a few more examples of bands that make heavy music, releasing an album with a pink cover that has a more accessible sound than their previous work. Just to be clear, I'm not saying this is either a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's an interesting pattern. But let's dive a little bit deeper. We'll go quite quickly because I think the general idea will be the same album to album. The first example I want to talk about is a special one, because not only is the album cover pink, the name of the album is actually Pink. This is Pink by Boris. Boris are a sludge, doom, drone, stoner metal band from Japan, and Pink came out in 2006. This album isn't exactly mainstream friendly or anything. It's still crushingly heavy and noisy in parts, but at this stage it was their most accessible album, as Pitchfork said in their original review, by some distance. Song structures were pretty straightforward, and the mixes of genres with nods to shoegaze, ambient, punk and post-rock offered more familiar territory for listeners coming from a more traditional rock and metal background. And again, if this was an attempt to break through to a wider audience, it worked. The album was met with widespread critical acclaim. It's far and away the band's most streamed project, and for a band with such a diverse and intimidating discography, it's still widely cited as the best entry point for new fans. And in many ways, Pink was a turning point for the band. Boris always liked to reinvent themselves on each album, but following the success of Pink, they started to experiment with genre much more overtly, even branching out into something like J-pop with 2011's Attention Please. So basically, a more accessible sound opening the band up to new fans, Pink cover. Okay, next example, another band with an imposing discography. Let's talk about I Want to Be There by Sadness. Sadness is a black gaze project by Mexican-born Damien Ojeda. Damien has been making music under the Sadness name since 2014, and this album came out in 2019. Black gaze is a subgenre which combines elements of black metal and shoegaze. To oversimplify it, think about it as black metal with distortion and a bigger focus on melody. And on this album, Sadness really leans on the shoegaze side of the genre, or at least takes the liberty of taking black metal to a new place. Fans of pure, raw black metal may be turned off by some of the more experimental, genre fusion stuff here. But fans of shoegaze, screamo, post-rock may find this to be a good entry point into A, Damien's discography, and B, the black gaze genre as a whole. It's melodic, it's pretty, it's dreamy. It utilizes choir vocals, which is unconventional, but I think adds a lot. The album feels nostalgic, melancholy. It will still pummel you with its crushing wall of sound. There's this very thick, heavy atmosphere, but it feels more comforting than depressing. It almost feels optimistic in some places. And once more, the album that plays with genre a little, gives new listeners a foot up, and has a pink cover, is by far the artist's most streamed and well-known album. Okay, the final album we're going to be talking about today is probably the most well-known and controversial example of this phenomenon. Of course, this is Sunbather by Deafheaven. This album was released by Californian group Deafheaven in 2013, and it blew up. I'd say this was the album that played the biggest part in popularising black gaze, and was probably a big inspiration for a band like Sadness, who we just talked about. Anyway, this album dropped and the internet went crazy. If you were in music spaces online, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing this pink cover, and boy were a lot of people not happy with that. I just kicked the camera, so I'm sorry if the camera angle is a little different for the end of this video. Yeah. Anyway, even as a teenager who wasn't tapped into black metal at all, I was having discourse about this album shoved down my throat. So what was all the fuss about? Basically, Deafheaven released an album with black metal influences, and this album had a pretty pink cover. And this seemed to upset some black metal fans greatly. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. Black metal is a genre that has a very defined aesthetic, one which hasn't really changed since its inception in the early 80s. You know, the spiky fonts, dark colours, the sinister imagery. Just have a scroll down the Rate Your Music charts for black metal. Have a look at some of the album art, some of the band names, the artist names, and compare them to this album. The title, Sunbather, the straight, almost delicate font, the pink gradient. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions, but generally there is a way that things are done in the black metal world. And some of the more hardcore fans of the genre felt that Deafheaven weren't doing things the right way, starting with releasing an album with a pink cover. Beyond that though, some fans felt like this album went against the very ethos and ideology of black metal. This is a genre that was created to eschew and confront facets of modern life, such as organised religion, consumerism, conformity. It's anti-establishment to its core. And just like other genres such as punk, hip-hop, especially in the 80s, and EDM, for many fans, black metal is a culture, it's an identity, it's a lifestyle. And with Deafheaven, there was a perceived lack of authenticity, a belief that they were co-opting elements of black metal and taking them into a commercial realm. This album was vulnerable in a way that the majority of black metal wasn't. The lyrics, the themes, the vibe, they were personal, romantic, grappling with insecurity, love, hope. And of course, sonically, this album takes those black metal elements and combines them with shoegaze, post-rock, screamo. To an untrained ear, this is still a heavy album. To a purist, however, the lighter, fuzzier moments may take away from a black metal experience and open the gates to listeners who have no respect for convention. In particular, in 2013, I remember a lot of ire being directed at hipsters and posers. And again, without wanting to cast judgment on either side, if this was an attempt by the band to become more accessible or even just to become a talking point, it kind of worked really well. As I said, this album was everywhere. It was a critical darling, it was ever present on year-end lists, even decade-end lists, and it remains comfortably the band's most streamed album. And I think the pink cover was a big part of that. It drew a lot of people in, and it's become one of the most iconic album covers of the last 15 years. So there we have it. What was the point of this video? Well, I think pink covers are beautiful. Something about them just feels special. And sometimes things are the way they are just because. But next time an artist releases an album with a pink cover, have a think about why they may have chosen it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, let's talk in the comments, and yeah, thanks again.